أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رضيت بالله ربا وبالإسلام دينا وبمحمد صلى الله عليه وسلم رسولا ونبيا رب أعوذ بك من همزات الشياطين وأعوذ بك رب أن يحضرون ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Continuing on with the Prophet ﷺ's legendary government military legacy, the era of Sayyidina Umar bin Al-Khattab, after completing 50 videos of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq's era, the legacy of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the military career of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a total of 30 videos. Continuing on now from page number 374, 4.3.1, Umar bin Khattab's and Umar bin Khattab and poetry. Umar was the most inclined to the righteously guided Khalifa to poetry and the commenting on it. And he quoted poetry on various occasions, so much so that it was said Umar ibn al-Khattab was hardly faced with any situation but he would quote poetry about it. It is narrated that he went out one day wearing a new cloak and people stared at him, and he said in a verse, "The treasure of Hormuz could not help me. Ad tried to be immortal but they all failed. Where are the kings to whom riders came from all directions? There is cistern from which everyone drinks, and we will inevitably drink from it too." End quote. The researcher will note that Umar had memorized a great deal of poetry, both ancient and contemporary, and he could recall it and quote it readily. This indicates that he had a vast and well-organized memory, because he always had something suitable on the tip of his tongue, which he could recall with ease. He even memorized poetry that expressed hatred of al-Islam. He recited to Hassan ibn Thabit what Hind bint Utbah had said against Hamza and the Muslims on the day of Uhud, which provoked Hassan to retaliate in kind. Hence, we can say that Umar bin Khattab was a sensitive man of refined feelings who could appreciate and recite poetry and express his opinions concerning it. But he was not a poet as such, as some researchers have suggested. The suggestion that he was a poet cannot be accepted by any fair-minded critic, because he lived among his people like an open book and he did not conceal anything from them. He held gatherings in which he met with other people, and if he had composed any poetry, these people would have narrated it from him and broadcast it amongst themselves, and it would have reached us through the narrators as his life story has reached us. Moreover, the earliest critics do not say anything about Umar being a poet, and Ibn Salam did not mention him in his Tabaqat, nor did Ibn Qutayba in his book Ashari wa Ashura. Al-Jahid did not mention that. Al-Jahiz, did not mention that in his book, in which he paid a great deal of attention to Umar's eloquence, and knowledge of literature. Al-Mubarad stated, as did Mutammam ibn Nuwayra in his eulogy of Malik ibn Nuwayra, that Umar said to Mutammam, and I quote, "If only I could compose verse as you did when you eulogized your brother." Umar loved that poetry that expressed, or he loved poetry that expressed the essence of al-Islamic life, and that in which explained Islamic principles and did not conflict with the teachings of the new religion or stray from its values. He encouraged Muslims to learn beautiful poetry and said, "Learn poetry, for in it are good things to be sought, bad things to be eliminated, and wisdom for those who seek it, and it encourages good manners." End quote. He wrote to Abu Musa al-Ashari, his governor in Iraq, saying, "Tell the people there to learn poetry, for it promotes good characteristics and enriches people's minds and increases knowledge of lineages." End quote. He did not stop there, rather he regarded poetry as the key to people's hearts, which motivated them to do good. Concerning the virtue and benefits of poetry, he said, and I quote, "The best skill a man can possess is the skill of composing poetry, which helps him to achieve what he wants, and by means of which he seeks the sympathy of the noble and to soften the hearts of the ignoble." In order to make their children's education complete, he commanded parents to recite beautiful poetry to them. He said, "Teach your children swimming and archery. Train them to be skilled on horseback and teach them beautiful poetry." End quote. Umar also took a keen interest in the poetry of the Jahiliyyah because of its connection to the Quran, as he said, "Hold on to your records and you will never go astray." End quote. Those who were listening to him said, "What are our records?" He said, "The poetry of Jahiliyyah, for in it there is an explanation of your book and the meaning of your language." End quote. This is in accordance with the attitude of his student, the interpreter of the Quran, Abdullah ibn Abbas, who said, "If you read something in the book of Allah which you did not understand, seek it in the poetry of the Arabs, for poetry is the record of the Arabs." Umar believed that poetry was the soundest kind of knowledge from the Jahiliyyah era. It is narrated that he said poetry was the knowledge of the people, and they did not have any sounder knowledge than it. And then Islam came, and the Arabs were distracted from poetry by jihad and fighting the Byzantines, and they did not narrate poetry. When Islam prevailed and the conquest came and the Arabs settled in the regions, they went back to narrating poetry they could. But, they could not find anything written down, but they got used to that. Then many of the Arabs died or were killed, so only a few of it was left, and most of it was lost. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu loved those poets who filled his heart with faith and sublime Islamic values, and put those values in verses which reflected a true commitment to Al-Islam and spoke of the virtues encouraged by Al-Islam. As for any other kind of poetry that went against it, Umar ibn al-Khattab rejected it and disapproved of it, and took a strict stance against such poets. What helped him to distinguish between the two types was his well-honed sensitivity and his good taste, which went straight to the heart of the text and explored the values that were compatible with Al-Islam and did not go against its teachings. Moving on now to page number 4.3.2. Umar and Hutayya and Az-Zubarqan ibn Badr. It was narrated that the poet Al-Hutayya Abu Mulaykha Jarwa ibn Aus from Banu Qutayya ibn Abbas was on his way to Iraq, fleeing from famine with his family and seeking to survive. He met Az-Zabarqan ibn Badr ibn Imru al-Qais ibn Khalaf At-Tamimi As-Sa'di, who was on his way to Umar with the zakah of his people. Az-Zabarqan recognized him and spoke with him, and realized what his situation was. So he asked him to stay with his people and wait for him to come back. So Al-Hutayya stayed with them, but Baqid ibn Amir ibn Shamas ibn Luway ibn Ja'far Anfu al-Naqa, who was an enemy of Zabaqan, managed to turn him against him and win him over to his side. He incited him against Az-Zabarqan, and he started to lampoon him in a verse and praise Banu Anf al-Naqa. These insults filled his stanzas, one of which Az-Zabarqan sent to Umar, in which Al-Hutayya said, "Do not bother with ambition, do not travel to achieve what you aspire to. Sit down and you will be fed and clothed." He complained to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and he said to me, "Do not bother with ambition," and quoted the lines of the verse. Umar said, "I cannot see any insult here. It is just a rebuke." Zabarqan said, "Is all my ambition simply to be fed and clothed?" Umar said, "Bring Hassan to me." So Hassan was brought and he asked him about it. He said, he did not lampoon him, he defecated on him. So Umar imprisoned him. Umar was the most knowledgeable of people concerning poetry, but in this case, when he was acting as a judge, he called on the help of experts in the field to give testimony. Excuse me. Then he issued his ruling. Al-Aqad said of Umar in this case, he put aside the fact that he himself was well versed in poetry and used to narrate it. All he was thinking of was that he was the judge who tried to avoid punishment if there was any doubt, and he did not judge according to what he knew without consulting those who were highly skilled in that field. When Umar was in prison, he started to seek Umar's pity, or when he was in the prison, he started to seek Umar's pity by writing poetry in which he denied that he was alleged to have done what it is that he was alleged to have done. But Umar did not accept his apology until he wrote more lines in which he spoke eloquently of his children, whom he described as little chicks, with no feathers and no one to feed them or take care of them, because he was their only breadwinner. But he had been cast into this dark place, and he asked Umar to pardon him. Umar wept, moved by these lines of poetry, and ordered that he be released. In order to silence him, he bought the honor of the Muslims for 3,000 dirhams. Al-Hutayyas composed more poetry complaining about that. It seems that Al-Hutayya was not convinced deep down that he should stop composing insulting poetry. So Umar summoned him, sat him down in front of him, and threatened to cut out his tongue. Al-Hutayya said, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, by Allah, I have not lampooned my father and my mother. I have lampooned my wife and I have lampooned myself." Umar smiled and let him off. Al-Hutayya stopped writing insulting poetry for the rest of Umar's reign. There is another similar incident that was narrated by an author, Az-Zahra al-Addab, where he said, Banu al-Ajlan were proud of their name because their ancestor Abdullah ibn Ka'b had been given the name of Al-Ajlan because of his haste, tajil, in bringing food and drink to his guests. It was an honor for them until An-Najashi, whose name was Qais ibn Amr ibn Ka'b, lampooned them in a verse in which he suggested that the name had come about when others told him, "O slave, go and milk the animal and be quick about it." The narrators say that Banu al-Ajlan complained about An-Najashi to Umar ibn al-Khattab about these lines, and he imprisoned him, and it was said that he whipped him too. The Khalifa Umar punished people for lampooning others in verses, but he also punished people for other types of poetry, such as casting aspersions on the Muslims' honor, provoking hatred among the Muslims, and speaking of Muslim women in poems. 4.3. Poetry turned Umar's strictness into gentleness and pity. Umayyah ibn al-Askar al-Kinani, who was one of the leaders of his people and had a son called Khalid, migrated to Al-Madinah during the Khalifa of Umar ibn al-Khattab and stayed there for a while. One day he met Talha ibn Ubaidullah and Zubayr ibn al-Awwam and asked them, "What deeds are best in Islam?" He said, "Jihad." He asked Umar to let him join the troops who were going to fight in Persia. Umayyah stood up and said to Umar, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, this day I will join the jihad. Were it not for my old age." His son Kilab, who was a devoted worshipper and an ascetic, stood up and said, "O Amir al-Mu'mineen, I will sell my soul to Allah, and I will sell this world for my hereafter." End quote. His father clung to him in a shade of a palm tree and said, "Do not leave your father and mother old and weak, who brought you up when you were small, and now when they need you, you want to leave them." He said, "But I am leaving them for something that is better for me," and he went out to fight after asking for his father's approval. His father was in the shade of the palm trees, and there was a pigeon calling her chicks. The old man saw it and wept, and the old woman saw it also, excuse me, and wept. Umayyah was blind, so his guide took him by the hand and led him to Umar, who was in the masjid. The old man composed lines of ayahs asking Umar to bring his son back. Umar wept and wrote to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, ordering him to send Kilab to him, and he sent him straight away. He came to Umar, who told him to come in. Then he sent for Umayyah, who spoke with him for a while. Then he asked him what would be the best thing that he could have that day. He said, for Kilab to be with me, so that I could smell him. He told Kilab to come out to him, and the old man got up and started smelling his son and weeping, and Umar started weeping. Those who were present wept too, and said to Kilab, stay with your parents and strive to please them. As long as they are alive, then you can do whatever you like after they are gone. Umar ordered that he be granted a stipend and let him go with his father. Kilab was one of the best of the Muslims, and he stayed with his parents until they died. A similar incident occurred when the well-known poet Shayban ibn al-Muqabbal as-Sa'di went with Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas to fight the Persians. His father al-Muqabbal, who was old and weak, was very scared for him, and he could not bear his absence. He composed lines of poetry in which he expressed his sorrows and fears. Excuse me. When Umar ibn al-Khattab heard them, he felt sorry for him and wept. He wrote to Sa'd telling him to send Shayban back, so he sent him back to his father. This was not the last incident of this kind. When Umar ibn Khattab was moved by poetry, many such incidents have been narrated, such as when Kharash ibn Abi Kharash al-Khudali migrated during the reign of Umar ibn Khattab and went out with the Muslims on a military campaign that penetrated deep into the enemy land. Abu Kharash came to Medina, where he sat before Umar and complained to him of how much he missed his son, telling him that he was a man whose family had all died and whose brothers had been killed, and he had no supporter or helper left except his son Kharash, who had left him and gone out campaign with the Muslims. He recited lines of poetry expressing these feelings. Umar was moved and wrote a letter instructing that Kharash be sent back to his father. He also issued instructions that anyone who had an elderly father should not go out to fight unless he gave him permission. Thus we may note that Umar ibn al-Khattab was moved by poetry, and because he was so moved he would weep, even though he was the one who was known for his toughness and determination. This is an indicative of sensitive and humane feelings, because he felt sympathy for the elderly and feeble fathers who needed their sons. Similarly, he felt sympathy for all those who were opposed or who were oppressed, or helpless, and could feel what they felt, as we have seen above with regard to poetry which lampooned others. 4.3.4 Umar's talent in evaluating poetry. Umar ibn al-Khattab was one of those who were most deeply influenced by the Messenger of Allah, even in his view of literature and his judgment of poetry and poets. There are many reports of his commenting on the critiquing literature or literary texts, most of which reports stem from the time of his khilaf. During the last 10 years of his life, these reports demonstrate how much he appreciated literature when he had developed a complete and mature view, as the result of a lifetime of education and experience. Hence, we should examine the factors and circumstances that help to develop and perfect his critical sense, taking into account the two halves of his life, Jahili and Islamic, as follows. During the Jahiliyyah, Umar was one of those who were responsible for guarding the values of the Jahiliyyah. He enjoyed a high position among the Quraysh, who at that time played a central role among the other Arabs, who looked up to them and loved them. The same was true in Al-Islam during the Caliph of Umar. Umar was well versed in Arabic poetry, both in Jahili and Islamic times, and he understood clearly what the mushrikeen, apostates and enemies of Islam said in verses against this new religion, al-Islam. Umar was knowledgeable about all aspects of Arab life, both during the Jahiliyyah and in al-Islam. He knew about their beliefs, history, lineage, conduct, and knowledge, which enabled him to critique words and express his opinion about them. From an early age, Umar was keen to join literary circles in which there were always chatter, recitation of poetry, and discussions about it. Appreciating it and commenting on it, when Umar became Muslim, he regarded sitting with men who would select the best words in conversation as they would select the best fruits as one of the three things that made him appreciate this world after prayer and excuse me, jihad in the path of Allah, jihad fi sabilillah, Jalla Jalaluh. Umar was also one of those who spent time in conversation with the Prophet ﷺ. When he was Khalif, he established a meeting place at the side of the mosque, which was called Al-Batha, which was attended by lovers and students of poetry. Umar, the companion of the Messenger of Allah, was far-sighted, brilliant, extraordinarily intelligent, and inspired, which made him grasp the right meaning of things, and he was hardly ever wrong. In addition to that, he had the capacity to be moved deeply by fine verse, for which he would express his appreciation and admiration. It was narrated that Mutammam ibn Nuwayra eulogized his brother Malik, who had met his end at the hands of the troops of Khalid ibn al-Walid during the Rida Wars. And Umar was so moved by his words that he went to him and said, I wish I had eulogized my brother Zayd ibn al-Khattab as you have eulogized your brother Malik. He said to him, O Abu Hafs, by Allah, if I had known that my brother would end up where your brother ended up, I would not have any need to eulogize him. Umar said, no one has ever consoled me as much as you did. It was narrated that Umar said to one of the sons of Haram ibn Sinan, recite to me some of what Zuhair said praising you. So he recited it, and he said he was praising you, and he spoke well. He said, O Amirul Mu'mineen, we used to reward him generously. Umar said, what you gave him has gone, but what he gave you is still here. And the standards that affected Umar's favoring of one's text over another or one poet over another were standards of form. These had to do with soundness of language. Because his taste was based on the eloquence and soundness of the Arabic, he was repelled by the grammatical mistakes, and any such mistakes in a text were sufficient for him to reject it. He would even punish those who had made mistakes in grammar. Inshallah, we will stop here on page number 385, leaving us roughly excuse me, with a good 145 pages or so left in the volume 1 before we get to the volume 2. And then we will go into, inshallah, Sayyidina Uthman bin Affan. Very important, Sayyidina Uthman bin Affan. But we really have to get through the volume 2 of Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab. It talks really about the conquest and, the different military commanders that were sent on these conquests and, the different battles there. Because these studies did start with the military career of the Prophet ﷺ. So we want to make sure that we do not leave anyone in the dark as to what the main topic of discussion is. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik wa tabarak asmu rabbik wa ta'ala jadduk wa la ilaha ghayruk wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billahi al-ali al-azim. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Salamun ala al-mursalin. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.